Across entirely different languages and eras, distinct vocabularies emerged to describe a very specific human mechanism. The ancient Chinese codified it as liangxin, the Greeks documented the daimonian. Much later, educators named it conscientization. These terms describe a precognitive check, an internal stop sign firing right before an action is taken. Integrating that precise precognitive moral faculty into the formal study of human decision-making is the ambition behind a proposed discipline called Consciencology. The goal is to move conscience out of the realm of subjective feeling and into the structure of an academic syllabus. Attempting to formalize human morality is inherently dangerous, because the moment you try to build a curriculum around what is right and wrong, the architect's own blind spots get poured into the foundation. History is littered with moral philosophies that were quickly weaponized. Unexamined studies of ethics easily devolve into simple morality plays, used by institutions to flatter their own history while condemning the actions of geopolitical rivals. Without extreme structural rigor, a pedagogy of conscience ceases to be an academic discipline at all. It functions merely as state-sanctioned propaganda, teaching a society how to justify itself. To strip away that cultural affection and historical favoritism, the discipline requires a strict first principles framework. Before any syllabus is finalized, the concepts must be run through 3 dialectic stress tests. The first test demands we map out the carrier mechanism. We have to identify exactly how a society successfully transmits its moral data across generations, through wars and over centuries. The second test requires identifying the precise mechanical vulnerabilities in human psychology and modern technology. We need to map the exact conditions where the precognitive pause gets entirely bypassed. The third test enforces absolute symmetry. The same analytical lens trained on the misdeeds of one global power must be applied with identical severity to the architects of the curriculum and their favored states. Only a framework capable of surviving these 3 stress tests without contradicting itself can be elevated from abstract philosophy into a functional, globally valid academic study. We begin the first test with a historical mystery. Western philosophy produced brilliant, isolated fragments of moral thought, like Socrates' internal voice, but frequently lost them over the course of centuries. In contrast, China managed to maintain a continuous, systematized moral sequence spanning roughly 2,500 years. A common assumption is that this deep continuity was heavily insulated by the physical geography of the region. The mountains and vast deserts supposedly protected this agrarian society from outside disruption. The historical record shows the exact opposite. The civilization was chronically vulnerable to northern nomads, enduring complete and total subjugation. The Mongols conquered the entirety of China in the 13th century, and the Manchus did the same in the 17th. Moral continuity in this region relied entirely on an unbroken institutional carrier, a system that outlived the physical walls meant to protect the state. This dual timeline model illustrates the difference. On the top, we see the Western fracture. Every few centuries, the underlying carrier of the idea changed. The language shifted from Greek to Latin, the pagan framework was replaced by the Christian, and the institutional custodians changed hands. The moral sequence had to be rediscovered rather than inherited. Look at the bottom timeline. The Chinese sequence was locked securely inside a massive, unbroken bureaucratic apparatus. It maintained a single script and a unified examination system, transmitting the exact same moral vocabulary for millennia. This historiographical machine possessed a highly unique mechanism. It literally swallowed its conquerors. To claim the mandate of heaven, each new ruling dynasty was required to write the official history of the dynasty they had just destroyed. To achieve dynastic legitimacy, the conquerors had to operate the exact same moral ledger that would eventually be used to evaluate their own reign. Nomadic warriors completely subdued the state, yet submitted themselves to a conscience-bearing instrument specifically designed to record their faults and convict them if they misbehaved. A civilization's pedagogy survives by building a transmission system that outlives the state. Proving data integrity is a function of the carrier, not geographic borders. The second test addresses a critical flaw in how modern professionals model human decision-making. We tend to drastically misunderstand how our own internal systems fail. This chart shows the standard incorrect assumption. We imagine conscience acting as a binary gatekeeper, a bouncer at the door of the mind that strictly identifies and blocks dark intelligence or malicious intent. History shatters this fallacy. Highly destructive actors did not operate without an internal moral compass. They possessed active, fully operational consciences while carrying out atrocities. The danger is that conscience is corruptible. Bad actors capture the mechanism, engineering self-justifying narratives, convincing the internal gatekeeper that there is nothing to stop. Edward Bernays, the pioneer of modern public relations, is a prime example. He systematically manipulated public behavior, but he sincerely believed he was engineering consent for the overall social good. This self-justified manipulation scaled rapidly into geopolitics. Corporate PR campaigns were deployed to manufacture foreign policy narratives, directly greasing the wheels for interventions and coups across Latin America. Decades later, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara architected the catastrophic escalation of the Vietnam War. He went to his grave wrestling with a conscience that was fully active the entire time it was producing systemic horror. To understand how the capture mechanism triggers, we have to isolate structural variables. The 1968 My Lai massacre required soldiers to manually override their conscience at close range, committing deliberate violence against unresisting civilians while looking directly at their faces. Modern aerial warfare changes the variables entirely. Extreme altitude and targeted crosshairs on a digital screen completely remove the physical proximity necessary for that internal pause to even fire. Consciencology has to abandon the myth of the moral filter. The study must map the precise structural, psychological, and technological mechanics bypassing the precognitive pause. The final test dictates the pedagogical rules of the curriculum. It relies on symmetrical scrutiny, a principle best understood through the mechanics of a rock tumbler. Bias within a classroom is highly productive when it meets resistance. Sharp, opposing viewpoints act like asymmetrical stones inside a rotating barrel, aggressively grinding against one another to create intellectual friction. The curriculum fails the moment an architect designs a structural exemption for a favored subject. Pulling one stone out of the barrel to protect it from the friction halts the entire mechanism. Unmet bias is not generative, it sets like concrete. Sparing a specific state or ideology from examination ensures students inherit the exact blind spots of their teacher. The historical record proves why these exemptions are fatal. Conscience is rarely killed by a foreign enemy across the border. It is most frequently targeted by the domestic in-group that finds the questioning inconvenient. Socrates was not executed by invading oligarchs. He was condemned to drink hemlock by the democratic consensus of his own Athenian peers. Baruch Spinoza discovered deep flaws in prevailing thought and was promptly expelled. The excommunication came not from an external empire, but his own congregation in Amsterdam. This establishes the standard of Wei-Zhen. Disclosed bias is an acceptable starting point for debate, but structural exemption is an instant failure of peer review. When applied to modern statecraft, the rule is absolute. If Western military interventions and corporate PR machines face severe scrutiny, geopolitical actions and domestic policies of favored rising powers must face the exact same analytical lens. A pedagogical framework that grants passes to its preferred subjects isn't teaching conscience. It is intentionally welding a blind spot into the factory floor. Having survived the 3 tests, we can assemble these deductions into the finalized architecture for a new academic syllabus. Pillar 1 dictates that the discipline will evaluate societies strictly on their institutional capability to transmit a moral vocabulary across generations. Pillar 2 requires the discipline to actively map out the specific psychological narratives and technological variables that successfully bypass human morality. Pillar 3 mandates absolute symmetry, strictly rejecting any in-group exemptions or favored historical narratives. By enforcing these 3 pillars, the study of conscience transitions from a vulnerable cultural affection into a hardened, globally viable humanities program. The linguistic expressions of this faculty vary wildly across cultures, but the core mechanism is identical everywhere it emerges. At its center, it is a single, urgent operational question firing in the mind. Is this right or wrong? Modern statecraft and AI-driven military infrastructures are rapidly accelerating toward automated execution. This speed compresses the decision cycle, stripping away the time required for a human to ask this question. The ultimate utilitarian purpose of Consciencology is to counter that velocity. We have to understand how this internal check works so we can force a precognitive pause back into the systems of power. The true value of this discipline does not lie in judging historical villains. Its value is acting as a catalyst, forcing millions to pause and reflect before the machinery of the future decides for them.